So welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining our Beginner's Guide to Metadata webinar. So we hope this is a good session. A quick introduction to ourselves. Astun Technology was founded back in 2005 by Mike Saunt and is the leader in open source geospatial solutions, which includes consultancy, support packages, GIS platforms, and obviously metadata. We produce metadata catalogues for the Environment Agency, for the Scottish Government, and for Ordnance Survey, as well as dozens of local authorities. Presenting our talk today, we've got Joe Cook. Joe has been with Astun since 2011 and is our data discoverability lead. Joe also chairs the AGI Gemini working group and is responsible for the Gemini metadata standard. Joe also sits on the project steering committee for the development of the GeoNetwork metadata catalogue. There's a lot of words in there. Jo is so keen on metadata that she has 2 t-shirts, and I think she's sporting one of them today. So I'll hand over to Jo now. I hope everyone enjoys the talk, and any questions, please pop them into the chat or we'll pick them up in the Q&A. Over to you, Jo.
Hello, and welcome everyone to this Thursday lunchtime. So yeah, we're going to have a quick run through basically everything you need to know to get going with metadata. So yeah, we're the data discoverability team at Astun Technology, and I'm not using the royal we there. We've got my colleague, my co-pilot Elena on the call as well. There we go, she's waving. So basically what we do is we work with GeoNetwork, the metadata catalogue, and other technologies to make it as easy as possible for people to create good quality metadata without being overwhelmed. You know, metadata is without a doubt a complicated and technical subject. So we're going to try and outline what it is, why it's important, and highlight some of the jargon that you might come across. And then finally set out some easy steps that you can undertake to get started. So first of all, you know, what is metadata? You know, it's usually described as data about data, but that doesn't really tell you much. So I asked my good friend on the internet, Mr. ChatGPT, for a bit of advice. And so Chat, as I like to call him, said, you know, metadata is often used to describe the characteristics of a piece of information. So if you're talking about a document, it's the date that it was created, the author, you know, if it's an image, it's the size of it or the length of a video. And that kind of information is really useful for organizing and managing your data, as well as helping to kind of search and retrieve it. So I said to ChatGPT, you know, why is it important? And basically, yes, it provides information about the context for data. So it allows people to make an informed choice about a piece of information. Is it the right piece of information for them? Do they fully understand it? As well as, yeah, being important for effective management and organisation and searching and such like. And as ChatGPT says, it supports security and privacy and plays a crucial role in the effective use and preservation of data. But also, it reduces risk and cost by ensuring that people find the right, basically know that the data set they've chosen is the correct one. It reduces the amount of time it takes them to search for data sets. It adds value and encourages innovation, because it allows people to kind of start mashing up different data sets and turning a single isolated data sets into something far more useful. So a good metadata catalogue will be optimized for this kind of discovery for both kind of humans and search engines. And it will provide user statistics and feedback options that help the data providers know which data sets are being used, providing ways for people to report problems and so on. So we've got a silly example there about a bus route and cat food correlation, but as a serious example here, if we think about COVID, we all got pretty good at looking at the metadata for data sets for COVID. So this is a local summary for my postcode in Lancaster, and if we look at this, we can see we've got a whole bunch of metadata here, and also a whole bunch of data sets that are being used. So first of all, you know, this being COVID, of course it's less important now, but it was really, really important to know when the data set was up, you know, when this web page was updated. Then we've also got here some boundaries that are output area boundaries, and we've got a cases data set here, which was updated on the 18th of February. We've got the vaccination data, which was updated on the 22nd of February. So that's all metadata, basically, and it's what makes this a useful web page. So the problem with metadata, as ChatGPT told us, is that it's complex, it's difficult to organize, and there are many different, there's standards to talk about, there's formats, there's terminology. So it is basically a bit of a challenge. So hopefully in the rest of this talk, we will try and make all of that a little bit easier to understand. So we're going to start with a bit of jargon. So XML. So metadata is often supplied in XML format because it's very flexible and it's a very extensible format. It's readable by both humans and machines. Humans tend to need a little bit of practice to learn to read it. But again, a good metadata catalog will kind of shield you from a lot of this complexity. So yeah, it's the most common format in which metadata is provided. It is actually both a language and a file format. So you'll see files that are called XML files, and then they're written in XML language. So XML takes the form of elements surrounded by start and end tags that describe what the element is and what type of thing it is. And I'll show you a quick example of that. So if we look at this, we can see that you know, there's a lot of technical stuff here, but if we look, we've got a section about the person that's responsible for this particular data set, and we've got the name of the organization, and that's surrounded by start and end tags. We've got their position, telephone number, and all of this is surrounded by these start and end tags. And you know, so we can see what's going on. So XML has a set of rules and things that define what should be in a metadata record. And these are defined by what are called schemas. So these are basically frameworks that set out what should be included in a metadata record. To avoid reinventing the wheel, schemas can kind of steal stuff from other schemas
to describe certain concepts.
So yeah, so schemas can take information from other schemas as well. So you have a basic schema for describing metadata, and that includes elements from schemas for describing geographic data, schemas for describing the quality of the data set. And the way that we actually kind of show which schema a record, an element comes from, is using what are called namespaces, and I'll show you that in a minute. And to be a valid metadata record, it must be both well formed, so it must have all those nice matching start and end tags and things like that, and it must be valid according to the various schemas that it uses. So if we go back to that record that I was talking about, so these bits at the beginning of a tag where it says GCO character string and such like, the GCO is the namespace, and we've got a bunch of different namespaces being used in this document. They're all defined at the top. You don't really need to know about namespaces particularly, but it's just to say that this is why XML looks like it does with the GCO, or the let's have another one, GMD. So these are all different types of schema to describe different types of information. Okay, so a little bit more about schemas. So you'll hear the terms schemas, standards, and profiles used a little bit interchangeably when people are talking about metadata. So generally speaking, we start with a schema, and that, as I said earlier, it specifies the structure of the metadata, what elements it needs to include, and whether it needs any controlled vocabularies. So that might be controlled lists of text terms used, for instance, as keywords. So a standard is a schema that has been developed and maintained by a standards organization. So it's like an official schema. An example of that would be Gemini, which is an official metadata schema for use in the UK. And all of those ISO standards are that you hear of are they've been developed and maintained by the British Standards Institute and the International Standards Organization. And then a profile is basically, it's an implementation of a standard in software, but sometimes it can also just be an extension to a standard, and sometimes both. Generally speaking, profiles have to be more strict than the standard that they extend. And what I mean by that is that a standard might say that an element, let's say the telephone number is only optional, but a metadata profile that's built on that standard might say, no, the telephone number is mandatory. So they can't be less strict, but they can be more. And they can do things like add new controlled vocabularies. They can also add things again from other standards, as long as they don't conflict with the core standard. So standards are set out in universal modeling language generally, and here's a quick diagram of what that looks like. It's basically a way of modeling the different elements and how they relate to each other. Generally, you can be shielded from all of this complexity, though, when you're writing metadata. But sometimes when you need to go and dig into the standard to find out what something means, you come across these diagrams that you have to try and make some sense out of. So in the UK, there are a couple of standards that you'll commonly encounter. So the core standard for geospatial metadata is ISO 19115. That's where the standard's actually defined in that universal modeling language. It's British Standards Institute standard. Unfortunately, it costs quite a lot of money to buy the paper version of it. So luckily, you don't tend to need to. And then ISO 19139 is that standard written in XML. So it's the one that's most appropriate for your metadata when you're actually writing a metadata document. Again, it's a British Standards Institute standard. And again, you can buy a copy of it. Again, it's quite expensive. Then finally, we've got UK Gemini, which is basically, it's a UK specific extension to that ISO 19139 for geospatial metadata in the UK. And the good news is that the standard is actually free on the AGI website. So luckily the most important standard that you need to know about is the one that's also free. So in the UK, this is pretty much the standard that you want to use. What it does is it adds some UK specific terms and code lists to the core standard. It reduces a few choices, like the language, for instance. It only focuses on the UK-based languages. And it also pulls in some elements from other standards, such as ISO 19119, which is for services. And so, yeah, Gemini is available on the UK, on the AGI website, and there's quite a lot of documentation about it, including very detailed information about all of the elements that are in it. So what about Inspire? Well, Inspire was an EU regulation. It was first implemented in 2007. You still have to do it because it was brought over as part of into UK law after Brexit. Basically, what Inspire says is that you need to provide metadata for a number of environmental data sets. It's all about sharing environmental spatial data. Luckily, it's pretty easy to comply with Inspire. A valid UK Gemini record is also Inspire compliant. You just have to add a keyword from the Inspire spatial data themes. And again, a good metadata catalog will give you the tools to do that. So how do you do it? Well, basically you identify your key environmental data sets. You provide Gemini metadata for them. You make that data available via web services. So that's your WMS and WFS URLs so that people can actually find that data. And then you publish it to data.gov.uk. So it's pretty straightforward. The Gemini metadata standard comes with templates and code lists for the Inspire keywords. So yeah, you do still have to do it even after Brexit, but it's pretty straightforward. So another thing that you might come across when you're talking about data and metadata is the idea of linked data. So if metadata is data about data, then linked data is data which is structured so that it can be easily connected and linked to other data sets. And it does that using standard web technologies such as URIs, which are universal resource indicators. A standard web address, HTTP, whatever, is a subset of those. And basically, they use those URIs to identify and make data available in a machine readable way. As part of the linked data environment, there's a few terms that you might come across that are kind of related to metadata. They sit in that intersection between the two. The URIs that I've already mentioned. We've got doubling core, which is it's a very, very basic metadata standard and linked data standard for describing any sort of resource. So not just spatial data sets, not just data sets really. So DCAT, and there's also a GeoDCAT, are profiles of doubling core, and they're quite commonly used in open data catalogs such as CCAN and things like that. So then you start to hear about RDF and triple statements. So RDF is Resource Description Framework, and it's again, it's a machine readable way of describing data sets. And triples or triple statements relate to the fact that RDF statements comprise a subject, a predicate or a relationship, and an object. And as an aside, just going back to Dublin Core relates to Dublin, Ohio, rather than Dublin in Ireland. And that sentence itself is a triple statement. So the subject is Dublin Core, the predicate is, or the relationship is relates to, and the object is Dublin, Ohio. So it's just a structured way of describing relationships between objects. And then finally, you'll probably hear about ontologies, and really ontologies are fancy words for concepts and for lists of concepts within a domain. So bringing this back to metadata, a good catalogue will allow you to work with both Dublin Core records and ontologies, as well as your more traditional XML-based metadata. So, are metadata catalogues just for spatial data? Well, hopefully, from what I've just been talking about, you'll see that there are not. But we can also use it for non-spatial data sets quite easily. But because the core ISO standard allows you to use elements from a bunch of other standards, you can extend metadata records to meet whatever your needs are in a kind of structured, standards compliant, interoperable way. So I've seen metadata catalogues used for recording workflows in quite a lot of detail. They're starting to be used for things like machine learning models. And then also for GDPR, you can use the concept of a metadata record to keep your GDPR compliance up to date. And you can do that all using the standards that are built into the metadata catalog, and just basically record the information that you want within those elements. So another term that gets bandied around quite a lot at the moment is QFAIR. So what is that all about? So QFAIR, the Q stands for quality. The hyphen is just a hyphen. The F is for findable, A for accessible, I for interoperable, and R for reusable. So this is basically about creating the best quality data in such a way that other people can find it and it can be reused, and basically it could be used alongside other data sets. So what this means is it needs to be in the kind of formats that other people can use. It needs to be not locked away in a filing cabinet in the basement. And the best way to do this is to use open standards, but the best of all approaches is to use open standards and formats for both the data and the metadata. So QFAIR is a big thing in the government at the moment about basically making it as easy as possible to find government data sets. But I think it's if you're starting out with metadata, it makes sense to follow these principles right from day one. So where do you start? So having kind of been through all of that kind of jargon, it's important to go back to the basics, really. There are a lot of benefits to creating metadata and making it available alongside your data, but it only really works if you get if you get the buy-in from the rest of your organization, if you can explain the benefits of data sharing to your organization, and there are many benefits, as we discussed earlier. It reduces risk, it reduces cost, you know, it encourages innovation, and basically it's just generally a good thing. And there are tools that you can use to help assess the current level of data sharing within your organization. These are called data maturity models, and what they do is kind of show you where your data sharing is kind of working, where it's not working, and they allow you to get some empirical results that you can use to help get that buy-in from people. And they also help you identify where you need to perhaps focus a little bit more work. So yeah, I mean, really, you know, creating metadata is about getting the best value out of your assets. There's not a lot of point in creating data sets, taking that time and effort in creating a data set, if you don't spend a little bit of extra time creating the metadata, basically to make sure that you get as much value as possible out of that data set. It is a bit overwhelming. So the thing is, you can just take it one step at a time. So if you're a metadata novice, or your organization currently doesn't really do a lot with metadata, then the first piece of advice I would give you is to keep it simple. You know, you don't need to go all in with a really, really complicated system. Spreadsheets are a really good place to start, to be honest, for keeping metadata. Important thing is to keep to a structure. Try and come up with a plan for what you want to record for each data set, and make sure that you do that. Yeah, metadata in a spreadsheet is better than no metadata at all. And it's always possible to script the insertion of that metadata that you've got in a spreadsheet into a catalogue. You know, that's quite a straightforward thing to do if you need to. And choose a few important data sets to start with. Think about the ones that do often get asked for, or that you do end up sharing with colleagues, and start with them. Don't worry about the ones that are really, really obscure and that only one person needs to use. If you want to take it to the next level, there are many metadata solutions out there. You really don't need to reinvent the wheel and handcraft your own solution. To make your life easier and that of people using your data, do think about adopting open source solutions that aid both sharing and discovery. Always be Q-fair. Think about that quality, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. But don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If your metadata or your data sets are not perfect, it doesn't matter. Getting something out there, sharing what you've got, and perhaps giving people the option to give you some feedback on it is far more important than ensuring that your data set and your metadata are perfect. And the important thing is that whatever stage you're at, we can help you out here with the tools to take that next step. You can go to the data discoverability section on our website to find out a bit more. And at that point, I think we've got time for some questions. So I'm going to hand over to Elena, who's going to host the question and answer section.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Jo, for this very informing webinar. Hopefully, our attendees here today have learned something useful about metadata. So we have no questions in the chat as of yet, but if people have any questions, feel free to post them or ask them. But we have a few questions that we have received beforehand. Oh, we have just received a question from David. if my data is evolving, how often do I need to revisit and refresh my metadata?
Okay, so that's a good question, and I mean, the simple answer is that if your data set changes daily, then you should really update the metadata daily. But being pragmatic, if the way that you would describe that data set is the same every day, then as long as you tell people that it updates daily and when it was last updated, that's probably enough to be getting on with. And it doesn't have to be arduous to keep the metadata up to date, because we tend to work with GeoNetwork, and we can use the GeoNetwork API to automatically update the metadata dates to reflect what's going on with the data set.
Thank you, Jo. I hope that answers the question. So we have a few questions that we have received beforehand. One of which is, which metadata schemas does GeoNetwork support?
Okay, so GeoNetwork, well, as of the most recent versions, GeoNetwork can support metadata in pretty much any of the standard schemas. So in the UK, we tend to focus on UK Gemini, but it will also support all of the kind of the core standards like ISO 19139. It will support doubling core, as we've discussed. And the nice thing about it is that you can, it's actually relatively straightforward to extend the schemas in GeoNetwork to support your use case. So if there's elements that you want to add, then you can do that in quite a straightforward way.
Thank you, Jo. And where is metadata stored? Is one of the other questions we have received.
So that really depends on the, well, it depends on a lot of things, really. You could theoretically store your metadata in a spreadsheet alongside your data set, or in an XML file alongside your data set. But if you've got it in a catalog, then like GeoNetwork, or there are alternatives, then that gives you a lot more flexibility, and it also is probably a little bit more secure. And then you can always export the metadata out as a file if you need to pass it on to someone else.
Thank you, Jo. And do you think there will ever be a time when metadata becomes obsolete?
I think people would like the answer to be yes, because it does add a small amount of complexity and time to the business of creating data sets. But I think that we're always going to need to know about the data. We're always going to need to know at least some facts about the data sets that we create. So no, I don't think it's ever going to be obsolete. I think what we can hope for and what we can work towards is making it as easy as possible to create it and to keep it up to date. And that's something that we're working towards at Astun, is how to make that process of creating and updating metadata as easy as we possibly can.
Thank you, Jo. And I think finally, when should I create metadata?
That's a really good question. I'd say that the easiest thing to do is to start creating your metadata when you first create the data set. And that way, if you do it alongside the data set, then it's all fresh in your mind as to when it was created and what you created it for. I think you're more likely to create kind of richer metadata if you do that, rather than leaving it till the end or leaving it till 4 years later to create a metadata record and think, well, what was it for originally, or who created it? So yeah, start it at the same time that you start the data, I think.
Thank you.
Well, if that's it from everyone, just like to say thank you very much for attending. If anyone's got any questions after, please feel free to get in touch with us. We will send out a recording of the webinar along with any other details. But thank you all very much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.